All right, you grasshoppers. Well, this is a huge day today. Big day. The famous Michael Ozanian from Forbes magazine is joining us. And that's right. You're famous. You laugh all you want, but you're famous. So those of you that don't know Mike, or do I have to call you Michael? Like, like we're friends. I call you Mike.
No, it's got to be Mike.
Okay. So Mike writes for Forbes magazine, and he does a lot of different jobs. And one of the big jobs he's got famous for is does all the sports valuations, actually around the world, right, for all the pro sports teams. And so all the owners either hate him or love him. There's nothing in between, right? If you get the number high enough, then they love you. If it's too low, then they don't.
The values are always too low and the profits too high. That's the general thing.
It's always that. Yes. Good. How are you doing?
We're doing good. I guess we're 3 months into the lockdown, and we're hanging in there. And as you can see from the camera, I've only gotten one haircut in 3 months, so I'm about ready for another one.
I've only got one hair left. That's what it is. Not a problem with me. Not a problem. Well, let's get right at it then. This is a really interesting topic for me. Mike and I met years ago. I think I was still in the agent business. And I'd also started a company, Post Game Strategies, which was designed to just provide opportunities, just as it says, for former athletes. And that kind of morphed into me. We basically put money together with deals and everything. And Mike and I met each other. I guess we did a video together, right? At Forbes way back a long time.
Yeah, maybe a couple of times. Yeah.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
We had a few discussions early on about NHL team values and the economics of hockey.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So obviously we're going through this pandemic right now, and revenues have dropped, and I'm expected to be down around all the sports, I guess, even going forward for a little while. And it's interesting. We had a little discussion this morning. The New York Mets are reportedly for sale. How do you get a deal done now when you don't know what the revenues are going to be?
Boy, I would be surprised if any deal was finalized now, at least till things get normalized, because as you just said, you don't know what revenue is going to be. You know, one thing that we've seen in the past is if you do come to terms on a deal, the price could be adjusted depending on what those revenues may be. So, I mean, if you're talking Major League Baseball right now, for example, the owners and the players are at loggerheads about how many games, how revenue would be shared, how much players would be paid. And there's hundreds of millions of dollars that, depending on how or if they come to terms, which could go towards the players or the owners. So in that type of instance, if you're discussing a deal with the Mets right now, you'd have to take into account an adjustment depending on what agreement the owners and players came to.
Right. You know, it's interesting you talk about that agreement between owners and players. And, all during that time I was an agent. I was an agent for 22 years. We went through the lockout at 04, 05. And there's a couple of times we had to shut it down because of labor issues. And Bob Goodenow was the head of the Players Association for most of the time that I was an agent. And then Donald Fehr from baseball came over. So I watched those guys prepare the players for contract, like CBA negotiations. And see, to me, I think the big thing with the players in baseball right now is that, and I think rightfully so, the players have always been able to stand firm against the owners, probably more so than any other league, right? I mean, the NFL has given in, NBA, NHL has given in to a certain extent and taken salary caps. I think a part of this negotiation is just a continuation of them saying, listen, we just can't give in to the owners. Once we start to give into, I know it's a unique situation, the pandemic, but I just think once they feel like, this is just purely my speculation, is once they feel like they give in some fashion to the owners, then now the owners go, okay, now we finally got these guys. They finally given in to us at some point. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that could be part of it, Tom. Next year, 2021, is the last year of the current labor agreement between the two sides. I have a feeling that I don't think, like years past, I think the players had a better understanding of what the revenue and profit or loss situation was with the teams. I think one thing that's different now is, and part of this is probably built on the mistrust of the two sides going back many decades. The last work stoppage in baseball was 1994, so it's been quite a while. Is that the owners, no matter what happens, what agreement, they're going to lose a lot of money this year. And a big reason for that, which is a little unique from the past, is that they've spent so much money on stadiums. So, for instance, The Texas Rangers supposed to move into a new ballpark this year, 1.2 billion or whatever it was. The owners of that team have already been making capital calls to cover, to pay for cost overruns in the stadium. The Braves play in a new stadium that they're still paying off. The Cubs and the Dodgers are still paying for renovations they've made to their stadiums, and the Cubs for around Wrigley Field. The Yankees make bond payments, have made their bond payment already. Last year, their bond payment for Yankee Stadium was $84 million. The Mets, we were talking about them, their bond payment last year for Citi Field was $44 million. That money's gone. And with no stadium revenue, no matter what agreement they come to with the players, those are losses that the owners are going to have to sustain. So from the owner's perspective, they're trying to mitigate their losses for this year in their agreement with the players. It's not like they're trying to come to an agreement to where they could have higher profits.
So would they lose more money if they played?
There is a point at which, in terms of how they pay the players, where they will definitely lose more money if they play. The only other thing that could influence their decision beyond that is how much brand equity will they destroy in the sport going forward if they don't have a season. So, for example, if they don't come to an agreement this year, what will that do to ticket revenue next year and the year after? We saw in 1994. That was very catastrophic for baseball. I mean, one of the end results was the Montreal Expos ended up being the Washington Nationals. The Expos used to draw very well, and they had a heck of a ball club. And it took a while for baseball to come back from that. Yeah. So that also figures into the math here for the owners.
See, I was going to disagree with you because I'm looking at you're right. You've gone back in history, and that's what happened. I'm just looking at hockey. When we had the lockout of 04-05 and lost the whole season, I think there's a lot of worry that what was damage was going to the sport. I don't think it did any damage. I think the fans came back. Probably, I think the game got even better. Right? I think they changed the rules. I know they changed the rules, sped up the game and everything, and the revenues just continued to grow and grow. But you're right, with the history of baseball, that has not been the case after missing a whole season. So.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with hockey, too, was, as you touched on, Tom, there were several changes that took place with hockey. And, in fact, hockey continued to expand.
Yeah.
But there was also some relocation, with Arizona, Atlanta, and some other teams. I think one of the things that really helped hockey, and this is where the connection is to baseball, though for different reasons. When I first started watching hockey in the late 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, the pace of the game was much slower than it is today. I mean, the game has a phenomenal speed to it today. Baseball.
I just this question
also had a change to it that brought fans back, and that was the home run, right. Which, as we learned after the fact, in many cases was because of the use of steroids, which brought people back. So the excitement of the game definitely brings people back, but I would argue that for hockey it was for better reasons. The rule changes. Which led to more of a skating and skill game, and also the sport started to become more national throughout the entire country. Versus baseball was because guys who used to hit 10 home runs were hitting 50.
Yeah, I want to look at this. We got a comment here by Steve Jerendoff. Steve's a friend of mine, actually a good friend of Kevin Allen's too. So this may be a perfect time to strike a deal to buy the Mets. These circumstances may be putting pressure on the Wilpons. He corrected that in another text to raise money for non-baseball reasons. So a better deal is likely possible. The future of team values seems unlikely to be worse. History will bear that out. Media values of teams are only going to go up, and media opportunities are only expanding. That's how he sees it. What do you think?
I think he's right. Baseball has 3 national broadcast partners: Turner, ESPN, and Fox. those deals with those three networks, I think, went another 2 years. But Fox has already increased or extended, I should say, its deal. They're the one of the three that has to way beyond that, and their increase was a 50% increase. Wow. So it shows you that baseball. A lot of people like to have been saying baseball's dying, baseball's dying. It's not dying. It's not nowhere near as popular as the NFL, but it's not dying. And also during the summer, okay, this year is a little bit different, but baseball is the one thing where there's a tremendous amount of programming. And so they have huge inventory, and those rights are still very, very valuable. So I would definitely agree with the increase in the value of those media rights.
Right. Interesting talking about the Mets too. We touched on this before as well. With Steve Cohen, the famous investor, potentially had been negotiating a deal. And my take on it is that I don't think the Wilpons were ever really serious about selling the team. Unless they got a huge number from him. I think it was more important. This is a credible investor that's made lots of money. I think that banks and everybody else is going to look and say, well, if Steve Cohen thinks it's worth this much money, then this is the value of the team, right? Because they negotiated and negotiated, and somewhere along, all of a sudden, in the middle of the negotiations, that part of the negotiations becomes that the Wilpons want to stay on and continue to run the team for like 5 years or something. I'm thinking to myself, well, Steve Cohen is not going to pay $3 billion for the New York Mets and then have the Wilpons run the team for him, right? That's just
that was always a little bit bizarre. I never thought of it from the angle that the Wilpons were looking to set a price for the team. That's very, very interesting and quite possible. Yeah, and from Cohen's point of view, what I had heard in talking to the sports bankers I know was I think part of the problem that Steve made is that by offering $2.6 billion, he figured nobody else would come close to that, so we get it. But Steve never had a sports banker representing him. So I think once he realized the risk he was that he would have by not being taken control for 5 years, he said, well, wait a minute. And he tried to he wanted to renegotiate that, because the way baseball works is their bylaws is until you're the managing partner, the control person, baseball owners don't vote on your ownership. So theoretically, he could have put in, if the sale price was $2.6 billion, he could have put in 1.5, 1.7 billion of equity. And then 5 years down the road, potentially the owners could have voted for him not to be the control person.
So, but wasn't it the Wilpons that threw that thing in that they wanted to run the team partway through the negotiations, or was it just brought up partway through the negotiations?
No, you're right. That was actually in the beginning, but I don't think what Steve knew, Steve Cohen, I don't think he realized that there would still be a vote in 5 years, which was the big risk factor. I mean, look at what's happened. I mean, who knows what could happen within a 5 year period.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I was under the impression it was something that the Wilpons just kind of threw in there down the road in the negotiations. But if it was already there at the start, it's kind of gets him
right.
out, right? Okay, yeah, I screwed up. Why wouldn't he? I guess he's a savvy guy. He thinks I don't need a banker, right? Is that what he's?
Yeah, I just didn't think he knew that nuance. That, well, what do you mean they could approve me to be put in the most amount of money and be the owner in terms of having the largest equity stake, but then still have to vote in 5 years for me to be the managing partner and the de facto control person. Right. He would not have been made the decisions in 5 years. And if you're coming in and you're putting all that money for the Mets, number one, you're in a very, you want to be able to make the decisions immediately, because number one, you're competing against the Yankees, who, as you know, right now are the top team in New York, and with their roster and the money that they have, are set to be very, very competitive, at least for the next few years. And number two, the Mets are in a very competitive division. You know, they've got the Braves, they've got the Nationals, they've got the Phillies. So you're going to want to come in, put in this money, and you say, I've got to improve this franchise from the get-go.
Right. Yeah, and I can't see, that's why I couldn't see, why would a Steve Cohen, well, I don't even know the man, but I'm assuming a successful man like that, he doesn't want to be second to anybody, and he doesn't want to have somebody else, former owner controlling the team, right? That's what really amazed me. Why would he even contemplate that? I thought he would have said right off the bat, listen, I'm going to spend all this money for the team. You're not running it for 5 years. Just not because of that clause that you mentioned before, just the fact that it's his team. Why is he going to have somebody else run it? But who knows? All right, let's switch over to the NHL a little bit. I mean, there's the values of franchises in the National Hockey League. I mean, are not gone where football and basketball and baseball are, but they've continued to rise. I mean, they got franchise fee for Vegas as an expansion team was $500 million. For Seattle, it jumped up to $750. Who did you say had the most valuable team? Was the New York Rangers the most valuable team in the league?
Yeah, I think the Rangers and still have the most valuable team. Probably, Toronto number 2, maybe Montreal number 3. That would be my pecking order. Toronto is a huge market, and even without having a Stanley Cup caliber team in a number of years, still generate a tremendous amount of money up there, and they have the great economics too of sharing the building with the Raptors. Right. But still, in terms of revenue, you're looking at the Rangers. And a lot of the old, the old first Big Six, the original 6 are doing very well. We've seen a huge resurgence in the Blackhawks over the past decade, winning 3 Stanley Cups. The Bruins winning a cup, which has brought those teams back. And I personally, I don't know your feeling as a former player, I'd be very interested. But I kind of like the restart agreement that Commissioner Bettman has put forward. It makes a lot of sense. I still think, in my opinion, as somebody who watches just about every sport, I think that playoff hockey is the most exciting thing to watch that there is. So I think it's huge for the league if they can get this done.
I agree totally, but I think the playoff hockey has become more and more exciting as the years gone on. I know there's some people that write that they don't necessarily like the parity that Mr. Bettman's been after all along, but to me, I mean, it's made all the playoffs rounds that we have from start to finish are much more exciting. There's really no blowouts anymore. It doesn't seem like it. It's Lightning lost 4 straight, but it was still exciting hockey. And I just think the parity is a big part of that, because every series you go into, the other team could legitimately win, and all games usually are close and everything. So I agree with you totally. And you know what? I just think the league does they just get it right all the time. I just feel like, like this restart, the 24 teams was a brilliant idea, right? Because you look at those teams like the Rangers, who were not really in the playoffs, but they were creeping towards the playoffs. You get them in there. It's more exciting for everybody. I love the way they handle stuff now. This stuff.
And I think it's important that people realize that more than any of the 4 major sports, more than baseball, basketball, and football, hockey depends on playoff revenue and local revenue to generate revenue, to generate profits. So, if you can break even for the regular season, and I'm not talking about like the Canadians or the Rangers, the top 3 or 4 teams, but by and large, for most of the NHL, if you can break even during the regular season and make the playoffs, that's great, because then what you're doing in the playoffs, let's say you're averaging $2 million in revenue a game or so, most of that's going to go to the bottom line. So economically, it made a lot of sense for the commissioner to cast a wider net for the playoffs than he normally would. And personally, as a fan, hey, look, I'm a Ranger fan, so we're in. So I'm really happy about that.
You know what? And they're playing so well too. I told people all the time, I said, they had a not terrible start, but they only had 3 games in the first 2 weeks. Got all these young players, and that's the worst thing for them, is to be sitting around for anybody, but especially young players. They need to be playing games, and I think it really set them back a little bit. But you could just see how they got better and better as time went on. They're 2 great young goaltenders coming up. And Henrik Lundqvist is still there as well. Panarin's unbelievable. I think Mika Zibanejad is kind of I really think it's funny to say this playing in New York, but he's like a hidden secret. I don't think people realize how good of a two-way player he is. Patrice Bergeron to me is the top two-way player, in my mind, one of the top forwards in the league with Sidney Crosby. But Zibanejad, his game is just, like both ends of the ice. You can see how the coach trusts him so much for important faceoffs and killing penalties, being out there late in the game. So I think they've got a great opportunity. So,
yeah, I think that more than any other sport, the athleticism of hockey has improved or changed the game the most over the last decade. With this work from home thing happening the last couple of months, I've been watching a lot of, of the old games in all the sports, baseball, football, basketball, all the classics. And I go back just like 15 years ago, I'm watching Ranger games from like '05, '07. They've been showing on MSG or the NHL network. And it's like a different sport almost, how much faster the game is now. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, like you touched on it, the rules are different. Like when I played in the 80s, it's hooking and holding, and like even the players they draft for different reasons. Like I was drafted in the 6th round. I was a big, tough, strong farm boy. They draft for different reasons. They draft to get skate and move the puck. It's more, they still need, physical game is still there, but it's more defensemen now are their job is more to get the puck out of the zone quicker. So ours was always that, but it was also to punish some people in our zone too, right? Like bang them on the boards in front of the net. But now it's when they're drafting these kids, they're drafted for their speed and their ability to move the puck out of the zone. So, hey, I want to go back to one thing you touched on there before with hockey, particularly. Do you think hockey more so than other sports is reliant on how good the team is on the ice? Like you mentioned, Toronto maybe hasn't had a track record of a great team, but that's Toronto, right? So that market's different. But if you go to places, like St. Louis or Pittsburgh or Dallas or Florida, if they're not a good team, they don't seem to fill the building as much. Is that more like that than other sports?
Yeah, and it's more important in hockey also because a much higher percentage of revenue comes from the arena than the other sports, because hockey has the lower national media deals, with even combining the Rogers deal in Canada and the the NBC deal in the United States. You can combine those two, and still hockey, its national TV money is much less than the other sports. So, the bright spot for hockey is if you look at its attendance and in particular what it sells out in terms of seating capacity, it's been doing really, really well. I still think the sport has a couple of franchises that I would say are in shaky ground financially. Certainly the Coyotes in Arizona, the Florida Panthers are still shaky. I think with those two markets, though, there are some factors at play. They've never quite gotten the proper arena situation. They've never gotten that straightened out in Arizona. Yeah. And in Florida, it's similar where they just haven't been able to draw that well. But, you go back and look at one of the more recent sales, the Carolina Hurricanes. There's a team that was struggling, losing money, now has new ownership. The franchise is doing better. And I think I think the Hurricanes are a great example of what you're talking about, Tom. When that team does really well, it draws.
Yes.
And when it's not doing well, particularly under the prior ownership, where the perception was among many fans that he wasn't investing enough into the team, it wasn't drawing. Yeah. So I think that the Hurricanes are a great example. And to me, that's a franchise that's turning the corner.
Right, I agree. So when a general manager and or president of a team goes to an owner and says, okay, we need to do a rebuild. We need to trade away our top players. They're making too much money. We're not going to make it where we want to make it right now with this group. We need to restart here. If you're in a place like Toronto, that means, okay, you're not going to win for, or the chances of winning are less for maybe 3 or 4 years. In a place like Toronto, you can get away with it then, right? Because the fans are coming back. But if you're in a place like a Pittsburgh, those places we mentioned, Florida particularly, and in Arizona, if you want to do a rebuild where you're saying, okay, we're not going to be very good for 3 or 4 years, that means we're really going to, our revenue is going to cut quite a bit because we're not having a lot of fans come in our building.
It's definitely a lot tougher. And that's where it gets to, you want to have the ownership that has the capital to withstand it, and that gets to a lot of going back to the commissioner's office where sometimes maybe it's not in the best interest of the league to necessarily allow the deal to go through to the person with the highest price, but perhaps to the owner that has the liquidity to be able to pump money into the franchise for a long period of time. I go back to the Coyotes, and I think that's been one of the problems there is the owners that they had there have not been well capitalized. Right. So that's been a contributing factor to the struggles of that franchise.
And then if you don't do the rebuild, so you never give your team a chance to get as good as it should get, you're just constantly kind of treading water. So that defeats the purpose too, because then you're not filling the building either. You've got a team that's in the middle of the pack, probably maybe not make the playoffs or get beat out in the first round. So your revenues are cut there. So it's almost like you've got to do a rebuild now, especially with this cap system. So for everybody that's watching, they say rebuild, as you're saying. The Rangers sent out that letter 3 years ago where they said, all right, fans, we're sorry, we're going to have to trade off our star players and restart this and get high draft picks, young kids coming in. When they've done that, and it's paid off, and it's different. It's New York, right? You can survive that, but it is that thing that if you never do that, and Detroit's going through this now too. They've been forced into a rebuild. But I think their problem was that they were always making the playoffs, and the owner, Mr. Ilitch, was still alive, and they felt some pressure to continue to try to do enough to make the playoffs, to keep that streak of 25 years or whatever going. But it really cost them because they never really got to, it's almost like you got to go to the bottom to get the high draft picks, and now your franchise gets built up again. So,
yeah, especially with hockey, where you have that very firm salary cap, you've got to really be willing to do that. And, it's never an easy call, but I think in hockey, it's amplified a lot. And, the Rangers, going back like 2012 through, I guess, 2015, they were on the cusp. They were in the finals once, semifinals once, and, they were right there. And that was not an easy call to make.
Yeah.
In retrospect, to me, it seems like the right call. Yeah. But, you got to hope that the fans buy in, that the sponsors buy in.
Yeah.
But to your point, it's certainly easier in New York, because they get a ton of money from Chase as a sponsor. Chase isn't going to pull out. It's a long-term partner. You go to these smaller areas like Florida, Arizona. It's a lot tougher. I mean, even in Atlanta, they've tried to have a hockey franchise there 2 or 3 times. It's never panned out. It's a tough market, so it's a lot more challenging in those markets.
Do you think some of it is too, like these teams you mentioned, Arizona and Florida in particular? When Florida first started, they played downtown, right? And now they went to the finals, but the building was packed all the time. Arizona, they played downtown, the building was packed all the time. Now they've moved these buildings outside of the city. And I guess it depends on the city, but it seems like that's part of it to me, right? Isn't it that they move these arenas to a place that's less convenient for the fans to get to?
Yeah, I think I'm a believer in that having the arenas in the cities is the way to go. I think another thing that hurt Florida was that the NBA, the Miami Heat, and the Florida Panthers play in 2 different buildings, like in Miami, which to me makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's going to be very interesting here in New York. As you know, the Islanders are building a new arena just on the cusp of Long Island, but for all practical purposes in New York City. So they're going to be competing with the Madison Square Garden and with the Barclays Center. Now, we talked about how important the playoffs are to making a profit. Well, what's become an increasingly bigger part of that equation has been non-hockey events or non-NBA events.
Yep.
These teams and team owners, I should say, could make several $1 million in profits from things like concerts and other shows, Disney on Ice, whatever the case may be that they have in those arenas. Now the owners of the Islanders, Rangers, and Barclays Center are going to be competing for those events. So it's become a very competitive market, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. My personal feeling is I think they would have been better off building the Islanders an arena further out on Long Island, maybe, instead of minimalizing, making a smaller Nassau Coliseum, doing a much bigger one or a modern one. But evidently, because of the politics, it never could get done.
Right. And then you add the Prudential Center, which isn't too far away, really. Right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, again,
how much was MSG affected when the Barclays Center came in, as far as the concerts and all those other events? Were they affected?
Not much. That's a great point. MSG still maintained the lead. If you look at figures reported by like Polestar, where they do concert tickets sold and stuff like that, there was a brief period, I don't know if it was 1 year or 2 years, where the Barclays Center either overtook MSG or got very close to them. But one of the reasons for that was the folks running the Barclays Center when Prokhorov owned the team were giving extremely generous terms to things like the fight promoters that were having fights there and the concerts. In other words, they were letting them keep the bulk of the profits in order to fill their arena. So I think, in my opinion, it was a little misleading. I think MSG was and still is the king of non-NBA or NHL events in the arena.
Well, obviously I'm biased, but I think it's Madison Square Garden, right? It's like there is no other building like Madison Square Garden. It's right in the middle of Manhattan. So yes, you're definitely right. It's going to be all that competition for all those arenas, but it's Madison Square Garden, right? Like if somebody wants to go into this area and do a concert, the preference would be Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, I mean, people will ask me, they'll say, well, how could the Knicks be can you value the Knicks as the most valuable team in the NBA over $4 billion? I mean, they're never good, but I say, look, you got to look at where the Knicks play. They play in Madison Square Garden. They play in the heart of Manhattan.
Yeah.
And I always draw the parallel to look at the Cubs. When the Ricketts family bought the Cubs in 2009 for then record pricing, it was $845 million, including a small piece in a sports network, regional sports network. They hadn't won the World Series since 1908 or something like that. That people thought that was a crazy price to pay. The lovable losers, the Cubs. Well, turned out to be a great price to pay because they ended up winning a World Series. The Ricketts were heroes.
Yeah.
And Wrigley Field always sells out. It was an undervalued asset. And I think that's what people would see with the Knicks. I mean, if you won an NBA title and you buy the Knicks and win the championship, they'd be building a statue of you.
No question. Yeah. I mean, look at the Rangers in '94 when they won, right? I mean, it's the people.
I still remember that. I remember being at that game, and I had a buddy of mine that I was working with at the time that was a season ticket holder, and he took me to a bunch of games during that run. And that year itself was just insane because I was working at the corner of 34th and 6th at the time. So, the Knicks, I think, went to the finals that year too.
Yeah.
So, Manhattan was just nuts, both of the teams going to the finals. But I remember walking out from game 7 and, I don't know when the finals was, with the end of May or early June or something. And it was surreal. There were people on skateboards running around with banners and, people playing instruments. It was just great. It was just crazy.
I remember watching that too, being a former athlete, playing in Madison Square Garden, watching the games, and you were very happy for them. But to be honest, I was really jealous too, because I'm thinking, oh my God, to imagine how it would feel to win a Stanley Cup in Manhattan, right? And then have the parade there and everything. I mean, you just know the intensity of the Ranger fans, from when I played to see that happen was great. So going forward now, we've got the pandemic, teams are making all these plans to come back and play. Where are we going to be at? I know you're not a doctor, and you don't know as far as when are they going to be able to get fans in the building, but where do you think we're going to be at financially with these teams? I mean, I've talked to people about the escrow system with the NHL's collective bargaining agreement. Typically, they take out anywhere from 10 to 20% every year. Then they get players get either all or some of that back. I mean, are they going to be taking the revenues dropping to the point where it's 30 or 40% of escrow can take other contracts?
I think if you do the math, the strict math, I think you're probably not far from being correct. But one of the things I've heard is, and this is true for all the sports leagues, is that because of their long-term national TV deals and their long-term national sponsorship deals, they may try to draw on some of that. For putting another way, getting an advance on some of that so that you don't see a significant drop in salary. That kind of seems right to me, because I don't think you'd want to see something like where you have the players who are going through the sacrifice today during this pandemic have to take the big hit, and players, 3, 4, 5 years down the road reap the reward from it.
That's a good point.
I think they'll work something out like that.
Yeah.
I think, as I've observed collective bargaining agreement in the NHL since the 80s, late 80s. My sense is that one of the big positives is the players' union used to be very divided.
Yeah.
There was a period there of great discord and mistrust. In fact, in the 90s, there was a revolt led by some members of the players' union. I think the players' union is much more unified right now. And I don't mean it just in the sense that unified against owners. I think that the best way I could put it, Tommy, is that I think that as long as they feel they're getting a fair deal, a reasonable deal, they're going to move forward and play.
Yeah.
And I see no reason why they're not going to get that.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. So you go back to when I played, and Alan Eagleson was running the Players Association. He ultimately went to jail because he was the things he was doing. He was more on the players' side, or excuse me, more on the owner's side than he was the players. And then we went to Bob Goodnow, and I was not a fan of Bob Goodnow's, but to his credit, he did a lot of great things for the players. I think he just got a little heavy-handed and with like the relationship. He was always butting heads. There's no working together. And I know it's tough, when you're working with owners and everything. I just think Donald Fair is that professional, intelligent guy. I mean, he's built a long reputation in the Major League Baseball Players Association and the deals that he's done. So he walks into a room with some real credibility. I just sense that, listen, it doesn't mean they're always going to get along with things, but there's more of a sense of, okay, let's work out deals together.
You know what, to hockey's credit, this players and owners negotiation in baseball has been, adjudicated in the press, right? Yeah. Both sides are doing that, and the player. You haven't seen that in hockey.
Yeah, I know. That's what tells me,
which is great. Fans don't want to hear that.
Right. That's why I don't think it's going to get done in baseball, because I don't think what I'm seeing, I don't think they're really serious about doing a deal. I think both of them are looking and saying, we're not going to be able to get something done. The players aren't going to move. And like you said, the players don't trust the owners. They just keep coming back with basically the same numbers. They made that deal in March that now they're reneging on, or that's what's reported. And but I agree with you. When you see that much talk in the media, that means they're really not serious about getting something done. The deal gets done when both sides are quiet. That's right.
And hockey's, you go back to Bob Goodnow, the labor negotiations in hockey, in some way you could draw a parallel, have changed just like the game on the ice, right? It's become much more sophisticated, much more finesse, and a lot less pummeling and grabbing and clutching, both in labor and on the ice.
I remember Bob, and again, he did a lot of good things. I don't want to be totally negative, but I didn't like his way of conducting himself. It was always like, in my mind, there's a lot of things he could have done differently. But I remember I was in those meetings as an agent, and he told us all before the 04-05 lockout that this was going to potentially take 2 years to get this settled. And we all sat there like most of the players did. Really not big, because there's no thought, like 2 years to get a deal done. But that's where it was headed. If he hadn't gotten removed, we missed the whole season. And then there was a revolt against Goodnow, and he was ousted, and Ted Saskin came in. He didn't last long. Then they moved on from that. But it was going to go 2 years. And the thought, I think to myself, I played 11 years. And the thought that I was going to miss if I wasn't playing then, but if it was happening when I was playing, if I was going to miss 2 years of an 11-year career, I go, are you nuts? It wasn't just the financial part of it either. It was just the fact I'd worked all my life to get to the National Hockey League, to think, I was going to miss 2 years of that. And I think that's where Bob really miscalculated, was thinking that he could hold the guys all together for 2 years of their careers. It was just, looking back at it, that was the biggest single reason I think he, it didn't work out.
It was a much harder fight too. I mean, I remember getting these documents when they were having the last labor battle, and what the NHL was proposing and what teams, what teams were showing were that, for instance, the accounting was so screwy. So they were saying that the Blackhawks and some other teams, I was looking at the financial statements. I had gotten my hands on them that the teams were proposing were getting no revenue from suites.
Yeah, I know.
When they were funneling it off to a different corporation. But I think, in comparing different sports, I think one way that we can gauge the optimism or pessimism going forward is, as you know, Madison Square Garden, the trading stock, which combined the Knicks and Rangers, as well as their arena businesses, because they own several arenas throughout the country, those stocks recently split. So you now have one stock that just trades which is for the Knicks and Rangers, you can see how that moves and how that's trading going forward. That'll tell you a lot what investors think and what some of the big money thinks about the prospects for the NBA and the NHL. And then on the other hand, the Atlanta Braves also trade. Their tracking stock is called Liberty Braves, and you could see how that stock does and how their financials are. So I'm very interested myself just to compare those two and see how they move in the days and weeks ahead based on how these labor negotiations go in terms of splitting revenues and the agreements with the players.
See, who else would come up with that other than Michael? I mean, that's like a little nugget there that everybody else is now not paying attention. So where are the Liberty Braves? Where's their stock at now? You know?
I don't know the price. I was looking on my phone yesterday at it, and I was just trying to see actually the volatility compared to how it's been moving relative to the overall market. And most recently, it's been doing better. Same thing with the Madison Square Garden sports stock. Right. So I think people, as they start to get away from the buzz that they're getting pummeled with every day, and this goes back to what that earlier message was you read about the prospects for sports teams. They're really starting to look at the long-term prospects of the media deals and for revenue growth in these sports. Yeah. And I think that is positive.
Okay. A few predictions then we'll go through the sports. Is Major League Baseball going to play this season?
No.
Ooh. And I think you're right. I agree with you on that too. Is the NHL going to play this season?
Yep, they're going to play, and I'm predicting extremely high ratings.
Good. Oh, that's another thing I was going to get to. We'll get on the other sports. Do you think that if they can't have full arenas, that may help the TV ratings? Because now the same fans still want to see the game, but they can't go to the game now. They're going to be home watching on TV.
It's possible, Tommy, but I think the bigger thing is people, guys like me, and certainly a lot of people, I even have nephews that are huge hockey fans, that are 20 years old. By the way, who I'm still trying to convince that Wayne Gretzky, I said, is not the greatest hockey player. I tell them that the greatest hockey player I ever saw was Bobby Orr.
I thought you were going to say my name. I think you were going to say Tom Laidlaw.
Well, I mean, besides Tom Laidlaw,
okay.
That's always a given. But I think it's gambling. I think, the way these, I'm watching sports and I'm sitting there looking at the TV and I got my two nephews on my side and, you're looking at the legalization of sports betting, their fantasy teams and moving players. I think the technology, the watching sports on, mobile devices and multiple screens and the sports betting in general, I think is going to be a huge reason why ratings are going to be very high.
Okay, so the NHL will come back July 31st, roughly. They're talking. I know some people are saying Mr. Bettman wants to get it back earlier, but they're going to be back in July. Is that accurate?
That's what I understand at this moment. I don't think it's finalized, but that's what they're aiming for.
Okay. Basketball, are they going to come back and play?
I think they're trying right around the same time. I think basketball, from last I read, was a little bit before NHL. But I think what they're trying to work out is you could set a league policy, but then you got to make sure, because different states and cities could have different policies. Now, the NBA is talking about having all their games in Orlando, so that would seem to be a little easier, as you just have one city to deal with. I'm not sure the NHL is final. They were talking about two different cities,
right?
And I'm not sure they finalized those yet.
They have not. The rumor is the lead cities are Columbus, Vegas, and Edmonton. That's the rumor. Those three are the lead. I don't know how accurate that is. Again, there's the issue then you got to get across the borders if you go to Edmonton. So I don't know how they do that. I guess it wouldn't matter until all those teams that are playing in those. That like in Edmonton then have to now switch over and come to the United States if there's still that 2 weeks. So that's where I kind of think it's going to be Vegas and Columbus. That's my thought. So
makes sense.
What are we left with? The NFL? They'll play.
I think the NFL is going to play. I still think it's I know this from talking to some of the teams. The plans that they're making is that they expect to have fans in the stands. I think that's a little optimistic at this point. Again, maybe it's easier to do in Atlanta than it is in New York. Again, you're talking about a $16 billion industry with the stadium revenue, about $5 billion. So I could see why they want to do it. But I think they're definitely going to have a season. I think it's going to be more difficult for college football. I think that's going to be much more challenging. Wells Fargo came out with a very, very in-depth report on June 1st for its investors that someone shared with me. And this report was actually looking at whether or not you should invest in the media stocks that telecast these games. But without getting too lost in the weeds, they think that college football they're going to miss a lot of games, which would be problematic, there, because you're also dealing with the problem there is who makes the decision. Is it the head of the NCAA? Is it the athletic director of the school? Is it the head of the conference? And can you have two sets of rules? Can you have football but not have the students go back to school? It's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, because people lose sight of the fact they are student athletes, right? So they're really just coming back as professionals. Then if they're not in school,
right? Exactly. Then they've got that whole issue.
Professionals that don't get paid. That you get me started on that topic with the NCAA. I know there's some things to help the players get paid some stuff, but I just think particularly with football and basketball, those kids that go there help everybody else make millions of dollars, and then once they're done with them, they ship them off back home, and they haven't even got an education. So.
That could be our next podcast.
Yes, that's a good one. Okay, so Major League Baseball is definitely not coming back. NHL in July, late July sometime. NBA around the same thing. NFL will be coming back. All right, so predictions then. You put you on the spot with the Rangers then. Who's going to win the Stanley Cup?
Boy, if I had to pick a team, I would. I hate to say this. God, this is hard to say. But I'm going to say the Flyers.
Oh, that's a little bit off the board.
What? I'm going to go with a surprise. I think that they just kind of had it really going. This whole thing of stopping and starting again leads another thing. Leads to a whole nother issue. I mean, I don't know how these guys stayed in shape and were preparing. It certainly wasn't walking a mile and a half a day like I've been trying to do, but I can't imagine. But the Flyers really impressed me the way that they've sort of turned the corner and came back this year. So who do you think?
Hold on, you get the Steve Chernoff. Are you guys buddies? Do you know Steve Chernoff?
No.
Steve, I know Steve used to have like a trading card company. I don't know if he still does that or not. That's how I've known Steve for many years. But he's now agreeing with everything you say. He says,
well, you asked me if I knew him, not if I didn't pay him.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that must be it. Well, I've got to go for the Rangers. I agree with you. I think it's such a wild card now. I love the Boston Bruins, the way they play. St. Louis plays great. I love their style of game. But I think it's all up in the air. It's just so many unknowns, like you said. What level of conditioning is everybody? I believe that the more talented teams are going to do better because they don't have to get that whole team system together as much. I think those like the Boston Bruins, the St. Louis that play that real, and they all do, but I mean, particularly those two teams, that real team game, it may take them a little bit longer to get going. So I'll go with the Rangers. How about the NBA? Who's going to win?
Boy, the NBA. I know the NBA not quite as well as the NHL. Well, as a wild card there, I mean, I'm not even sure if they decide because they're still going to play some of the regular season, I guess. So I don't know. Maybe a team like the Clippers have a shot. Somebody like them, a surprise.
I don't know either. I'm going to go with the Lakers just because LeBron's there. I don't know if they're even in the playoffs or not, but I think LeBron's there. I will go with him. NFL, who's going to win?
Boy, the NFL, it would be really funny if either the Patriots or the Tampa Bay Bucks won it, or somehow play just because of the whole Tom Brady scenario. That's going to be a fascinating situation. Boy, that's a tough one. Just because I really don't have a good handle on the NFL, and I hate to pick the Chiefs to repeat, although they got to be sitting really pretty right now. I guess as a shocker, the Packers have improved a lot, so I'll go with the Pack.
Oh, there's going to be turmoil there, but that new
Oh
quarterback,
yeah,
Aaron Rodgers, is going to be whining all season long. Well, I'm a huge Giant fan, but I've got to go with Patrick Mahomes. I just think he's the most fantastic player I've seen in a while. And they've got a good team there, well coached. So we're going to go to Kansas City there. So, all right, we got it all figured out. Everything's like video. That's all people have to do is watch this interview. They don't need to know anything else. Don't need to watch any other TV. Everything's all figured out right here. So, it was great having you, Mike. You're
Thanks
a good
for
man.
having me, Tommy. I loved it.
Yeah, we had a great time. We'll do it again too.
I look forward to it.
All right.
See you soon, bud.
You too.